I just looked it up. The UK is $52,000 of GDP per capita. US is 80. Singapore is 90. Not even the U.S. is perfect. The UK only needs to be as dysfunctional as the U.S. to get up from 50 to 80, which would be, a dramatic improvement in people's standard of living. The U.S., as a wag put it, is the healthiest horse in the glue factory. But the long-term slowdown in economic growth is cut down in the 2% range in the U.S., where it used to be 4%. Well, that's better than zero, which is what it is in the UK and Europe. Unfortunately, growth is it needs weeding. It needs what I call the Marie Kondo approach to our public affairs. Clean out the sock drawer, clean out the underwear drawer. Oh my gosh, wash the dishes in the kitchen, and here comes the garage. So each dysfunctional market needs to be fixed in its own way.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Tom Clockerty, and I'm delighted to be joined on the podcast today by John Cochrane. John is known for his blog, The Grumpy Economist, although he does seem rather cheerful to me. He's a fellow of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Before that, he was a professor of finance at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. He literally wrote the textbook on asset pricing, and he has two books out at the moment. 2023's Fiscal Theory of the Price Level, and a new one this year, Crisis Cycle, Challenges, Evolution, and the Future of the Euro, with his co-authors Louis Garicano and Klaus Mazurk. Now, we're going to talk about those two books, John. But first, actually, I want to talk about the issue that really animates us here at the IEA, and big deal in Britain, big deal everywhere perhaps, which is economic growth. And let me give you just the context to this question. Welcome, by the way. Really delighted to have you here. On the way into work this morning, I was re-listening to a podcast, an episode of Econ Talk you did with Russ Roberts. I think it was a live recording from 2016. And you were talking about economic growth, how important it was. This was really, I guess it was framed by the great stagnation, which a lot of people were talking about at the time, and the need for tax reform, regulatory reform, and a general pro-growth effort. And re-listening to that, I thought, wow, pretty much everything you said then, 9 and a bit years ago, resonates extremely strongly in the UK today. Now, obviously, you have to change some of the details. But what you were talking about there is what we talk about on our weekly podcast every week. So we're obviously where the US was roughly in 2016. The question is, to kick this off, is the US still there? Because we look at the US and we think, well, they grow much faster than us. Their income levels are much higher. In a way, in Britain and in Europe, the yardstick we measure ourselves against is the US. And we're trying to think, how can we catch up? But is the US really doing that well? Do you still see a lot of problems there?
Yeah, I still see plenty of problems. The U.S., as a wag put it, is the healthiest horse in the glue factory. But the long-term slowdown in economic growth from its booming in the 1960s, a bit slower in the 70s, revived a bit in the 80s, and then after 2000 is cut down in the 2% range in the U.S., where it used to be 4%. Well, that's better than zero, which is what it is in the UK and Europe. And really the tragedy in UK and Europe is that growth just stopped in the year about 2010 and hasn't revived since. So stagnation is ever the issue. I think the recent bout of inflation taught us that much of what we were talking about in 2016 is not true. There was a discussion, not among people of our ilk, but in the policy regime, of how this was secular stagnation, lack of demand, so that all we needed to do was print up some money and hand it out, and happy days would be with us again. Well, in 2021, they did exactly what was asked, and we got inflation. So if ever you needed a convincing that this is a supply-side phenomenon, if I can use some loose language, that was it. And so here we are stuck with the eternally stagnant supply-side phenomenon. Now, the U.S. is, we are doing better than the UK, and the numbers are pretty staggering. I just looked it up. The UK is $52,000 of GDP per capita. U.S. is 80. Singapore is 90. Not even the U.S. is perfect, but so we talk about frontier growth with new ideas, new technology, and productivity versus catch-up growth, And, the UK only needs to be as dysfunctional as the US to get up from 50 to 80, which would be, a dramatic improvement in people's standard of living. So I would say that remains the question, but it's always the question. That's the wonder of us free marketers is for 250 years, we bang our fist on the table with the same answer. We're always right, but just more of it.
Yeah. Well, tell me about those answers or how you get to those answers. So I suppose, how does America get out of the glue factory altogether? How does Britain catch up with America or other European countries? What are the things, in your view, that we need to do to get growth going?
Yeah. So there's two kinds of growth. There's frontier growth, take an economy using current technology that is as efficient as humanly possible, then only new ideas and better technology will help. And it is kind of funny, in the year since 2016, of course, AI has come along.
Right.
And now all the people who like to blabber and blabber prognosticating about the future, instead of my entire professional career, we've been worried about slow growth. They are now worried about the singularity where GDP goes to infinity. And what about the jobs? Worry, worry, worry. We should be so lucky.
Right. I mean, yeah, infinity GDP, we don't need jobs.
Yeah. Worrying about what our policies will be to manage that is, that's the kind of worry we should have. If we compressed everything that's happened here since 1750 into 10 years, that would be just lovely. I don't think it's coming that quickly. Now, that's frontier growth. Then there's catch-up growth. Can we do with our economies more efficiently? Can we speed the process of innovation, even the adoption of AI, up, or largely get out of the way? And you and I are sort of get out of the way types. So when you add up the nagging inefficiencies in all of our economies, not just in doing things we know how to do, but in investing in new technologies, it seems like a gaping wound. And those are at least you can fix the things you know how to fix. And so we know how to fix those things. So the problem with growth, and that's why this will be a longer conversation, is I like to call it stimulus is lovely. We just, from a political and conceptual point of view, throw money around and the garden will grow. Throw fertilizer on the garden. Unfortunately, growth is it needs weeding. It needs what I call the Marie Kondo approach to our public affairs. Clean out the sock drawer, clean out the underwear drawer. Oh my gosh, wash the dishes in the kitchen, and here comes the garage. So each dysfunctional market needs to be fixed in its own way. It's a process of institutional reform. Institutional reform is difficult. And I think politically, that is one, we'll probably get to there. One of the difficult moments right now is all of our public institutions are hidebound, incompetent, and seem incapable of reform. But that is the job. And we could just start with cost bloat, how incredibly hard it is to build anything in the U.S. or the U.K. these days. I come from California, the land of the high-speed train. You may not know this story. In 2005, plans were built for a high-speed train from L.A. to San Francisco. Whether it makes any sense or not, let's not discuss. It actually doesn't, but okay.
Yeah.
Our entire political establishment wants a high-speed train. In 2008, Barack Obama gave it some shovel-ready stimulus projects. Well, here we are, $20 billion spent, $120 billion on budget, which is just outrageous amount of money for a train that mostly goes down a flat valley. 0 miles of track laid. Shanghai to Beijing, the entire Chinese high-speed rail network has been built in the time this has taken to absorb environmental and consultant studies, and nothing happens. Your own infrastructure has the same thing. Housing, good luck building any housing, because good luck getting the permits. I think this is something that there's some hope, because a left and right in the U.S., at least, is realizing, as here, that this cost bloat, this endless permits to get anything done, is getting in our way. And fortunately, it came from the left. They realized, we have a climate crisis. We need to have windmills tomorrow, but it takes 15 years to get the permits to hook a windmill up to the grid. They are realizing in California, you can't get the permits to build houses. No wonder houses are so expensive. We need to allow people to build houses, not government-provided affordable housing. We need to let them build houses. So my view is that we have all the ideas, we just can't get the permits, and that this is symptomatic of the broader institutional reform needed in both of our countries. I've talked too long, so you should ask a question.
No, I will. And actually, I mean, I think the really striking thing about what you've just said is that it almost sounds like California is Britain with much better weather, because you could tell a very similar story about high-speed rail 2, which is meant to go from London to Manchester, but now it's only going to go to Birmingham or maybe a little further, and it might not reach all the way into the centre of London now. And famously, they spent £100 million building a bat tunnel for an unspecified but small number of bats to protect them from the the environmental fallout of this high-speed rail line. And I think if I was speaking to a British economist and asking the same questions, they too would have started with land use planning, zoning, permits, environmental studies, consultations, and the way that there is just so much sand in the gears. We are really standing in our own way to an extraordinary degree. So I mean, you talked about really, if we want to unlock growth, if we want to restore dynamism, we need institutional reforms that will remove barriers, basically, will get out of the way. So land use planning, zoning in American parlance, great place to start. What else is on your short list or your hit list, if you like?
Oh, my gosh. Well,
the biggest priorities.
The problem with regulations is there's hundreds of thousands of them. And in fact, we think regulation environmental. Most regulation is, in fact, economic regulation. Most businesses are very highly regulated. The terms of, just labor it's very hard to hire people, and it's very hard to fire people. I was reading this morning, there's thousands of anecdotes. New York City has a tiered system of minimum wages. If you are building an apartment building that has less than 100 units, there's no special minimum wage. From 100 to 200, the minimum wage is like $60 an hour, and 200 and up, the minimum wage is like $80 an hour. Well, guess what? People build 99-unit apartment buildings, if they build apartment buildings at all. What is this doing? So there's thousands of labor regulations getting in the way of firing people, and so that would be high on my list. There is what we're seeing right now, the crony capitalism of tariffs. You have to run to Washington to be able to get inputs. And in many ways, the regulatory thicket has been used in the U.S. to bludgeon compliance. You wouldn't want a visit from the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Fair Labor Standings Board, so on and so forth. Immigration remains, I think, a central place for growth. We are, both the UK and the US, are fortunate that lots of people around the world want to come join our societies, work hard, start businesses, pay taxes, join our countries. Unfortunately, we have an incredibly chaotic immigration system based on asylum that lets people in and then doesn't let them work and encourages them not to assimilate, which is a political disaster and going to make that harder. So regulations everywhere you look. How did you get this little building rehabbed ever, I wonder, in historic central London?
Yeah, hard to do anything because we're grade 2 listed, which means, yes, permission required for pretty much anything you might want to do.
Which then takes years and years and many consultant fees and so forth, and just drives up costs forever, yes.
And I think one of the things you've written about and talked about in the past, just thinking of the regulatory state or the administrative state in the US writ large, how difficult in a way it is for economists and policy reformers to grapple with, because it's not that there are these, I mean, sometimes there are specific regulations that you can point to and say, this is bad, we should get rid of this, and that would have a positive effect. But very often it's the cumulative effect of lots of little things that each by themselves seem reasonable enough, and each by themselves probably have some interest group backing them. And so you get the natural bureaucratic risk aversion. Oh, I better not get rid of that. The gains are limited and there might be some danger involved. And yet it seems to me the sheer burden of regulation and the sense that we're sort of swimming through thickets of red tape, I'm mixing metaphors horribly, is one of the key things just dragging our economic performance down and our living standards down. But is there a way to deal with that?
That's you exactly got the difficulty of it.
Yeah.
Each one sounds plausible on the surface. Nobody actually adds up the cost of what does it take to check is the one more permit, is the white color of your paint historically appropriate? Well, that's going to be another week to go check with a paint consultant or whatever it was that you had to do. And I think it is deliberately obscure. So let's just back up a second. Let me try to offer a grand picture, which I'm better at than the details. I mean, if it were easy to see where it is and how to fix it, then it would have gotten fixed. So those who don't want it fixed make it deliberately obscure. It also gives an expertise of people who know how the regulations work to grease the system. Economists have a theory of regulation, which we deliver in Econ 101 lectures, I think, to great harm. And here's how Economics 101 is taught. You spend a week on the mythical wonders of the mythical free market, rolling your eyes. You have to put me in a tweed suit and, looking a little more disheveled than I am. And then you start in on 10 weeks of, there's a market failure that the benevolent regulator will fix with some appropriate, minimally crafted intervention. Now, you take that, so economists tend to love regulation.
Yeah.
But if you take that concept and go out and try to study regulations that you see, it explains nothing of what we actually see out there. Our Federal Trade Commission bears no resemblance to actually undoing monopolies that are harmful to the consumer. They've got something else in mind, but that doesn't explain what to do. So what does explain the regulations we see? Where I'm going for is I think it's useful to understand the forces that bring it to bear. Well, one is, of course, the classic capture. The industries actually don't mind the regulation because once you have gotten a compliance department together and you've gotten to know the regulators and you've hired a bunch of them as consultants, this is a dandy way of stopping competition from coming in. Jamie Dimon, the head of Citibank, once said this. In the end, Dodd-Frank isn't so bad after all because it cost us $100 million to build a compliance department. No one else can do that. That's a dandy barrier to entry. Now, of course, there is the darker side that politicians use regulation to extort compliance out of businesses. We saw this in the Twitter files, for example. Oh, we need you to censor what you're doing on Twitter. You wouldn't want a visit from the regulators now, would you? But a lot of what regulation does is to stop growth. It is explicitly there to stop growth. Why? To protect the old ways of doing things. And the easiest way to see this is, taxis versus Uber. Uber came in offering great employment opportunities for all the sorts of people who kind of need employment opportunities, using cars that are otherwise unused and providing us with more flexible, cheaper rides. Why not? There's a lovely economic growth and efficiency. Well, the taxi unions hate it. Which side was the government on? The side of the taxi unions. So protecting politically powerful interests is and stopping growth, because growth is uncomfortable. Everybody hates it. From the day the Industrial Revolution started in the north of England, and they're spinning thread and weaving cloth, and the weavers are going, wait a minute, we don't like this at all. Well, the weavers were hurt. The weavers' children did much better, but the weavers were hurt, and they would have loved to have stopped it. Well, that is the difficult. All growth seems to come by undoing all the profits of existing businesses who hate it. The other thing regulation does, like labor regulation, what is going on with that minimum wage, that tiered minimum wage? Well, what the government tries to do is to tilt the scales of bilateral negotiations. So, they want to help the worker gain more at the expense of the owner, and really at the expense of the person who's going to finally buy the house. So that's what the regulations. There's no market failure or something in there. So I think it's worth. This was a slightly long lecture, but I think we need to understand where it came from in order to attack it. Understand what the powerful political forces are that keep this whole anti-growth thing going, which is just It's bad in the U.S. It's worse in the U.K. It's terrible in India, where people who want the current ways of doing things are able to block reform.
Yeah. In a moment, I'm going to move on to some of your recent work on central banks' monetary policy. But before we do that, I have to ask you a question about tax because regular listeners will know tax is my favorite topic by far. And I think you have something quite good to say on tax. So just the big picture tax reform, what we should be aiming for. What's your take on that?
Yeah, we need to do taxes and we need to get to energy and climate too, which is, I think, a very important one for the UK. So taxes, yeah. Here too, I think it's good to understand the big picture difference in how we think of things. Economists think about taxes, if they're being honest, entirely in terms of incentives. If I work an extra hour, how much do I get to actually benefit from the results? That's my incentive to work. Politics and economists, when they're not staying in their lane of expertise, think about taxes entirely in terms of redistribution. I'm going to take from the bad people and give it to the good people and forget about the incentives. Now, this is, I think, everywhere. All of public policy doesn't think about the incentives. They think about the distributions. Whereas is what Adam Smith taught us about growth is that little Pandora in the box of redistribution. Hey, let's get the incentives right. Since no one's thinking about it, I think that's where we have a great opportunity.
Yeah.
I think that's, why is it screwed up? Because no one's thinking about it. Oh, if we just pay a little more attention to incentives. Okay, that was the preamble. So let's design a tax system as economists. And the question we want to ask is, how do you raise revenue for the government for all of its wonderful, needy expenditures at minimum cost to the economy? Well, you want the lowest possible marginal rate. You want to reduce those disincentives. And the answer is, I'm sure you've said this 100 times before, we want a simple consumption tax applied to everything, period.
Yeah.
Now, the U.S. tax code is particularly Swiss cheese of very high statutory marginal rates and all sorts of deductions, inclusions, exemptions, and so forth, so that we don't actually raise much revenue for it. It's about the opposite. How could you maximize the marginal rates, maximize the amount of lawyer, accountant, and tax time to comply with it, and minimize the revenue that is thereby generated? In part, so that politically you can say, oh, look, we're taxing the rich, but in fact, the rich don't pay any taxes because once you get past $100 million, you can afford all the lawyers and accountants and loopholes to not actually pay the taxes. So yeah, the tax reform I would love to see is eliminate the income tax, eliminate the estate tax, eliminate the corporate tax, have just a uniform sales tax, same rate on absolutely everything. And that would, the annoying compliance costs. You guys have no sense of how horrible the U.S. income tax system is because you don't have to fill out.
Yeah, I lived there for 6 years and my wife's American, so I know, but most of our listeners probably
won't. My gosh. Oh, my gosh. What an obscenity that is. But then the marginal rates are, we say, oh, tax the rich. Well, suppose you're a rich person living in California, a high earner. You pay 42% federal, 13.5% state on top, non-deductible, so it's 55 right there. 10% sales tax on anything you actually spend, your share of the corporate taxes and so forth in the form of higher prices, a 1% tax on your very overpriced house. So, that's about 5% of your income. We're well into the 70% range. So when our lefties say we should have a 70% tax rate, I say, great, that would be a cut. And the incentive effect is there. If I take a consulting job, I'm not quite at that high earner level, but I don't get to actually consume that much of it. And that's, pervades the tax code.
Yeah. Well, you brought up energy and climate. Do you want to talk about energy and climate before we go to central banks?
Well, I think that was one of the important questions for institutional reform. And institutional reform is the political flip side. Let me first institutional reform and second energy and climate. It's the political flip side of our moment right now. All of the institutions, what's going on politically, the U.S. is ahead of the U.K., I think, too, but you're ready to catch up. All of the standard institutions have been revealed to be incompetent and politicized. So, in my own wheelhouse, we had this financial crisis. What the hell? Then the macro institutions that are supposed to handle things. 10% inflation when the target was 2%. What the hell happened there? We saw the completely crazy immigration system. Everybody sees that's failing. The universities have become hotbeds of crazy, extreme left liberal dogma. Everyone sees that rotten. And I think that, one of the final straws was the public health institutions in COVID revealed them. So, we always thought they knew what they were doing, but it turns out they don't know what they're doing either. So how do we I think a lot of our political moment is reforming those. And part of that I see coming, the energy climate consensus is one more where I think the average Joe is going to be realized very quickly. He was lied to tremendous cost. Europe essentially deindustrialized on energy policies that don't do anything to actually help the climate. So on a cost-benefit basis, it is infinite. It is whatever negative infinity is, because I think they actually hurt the climate rather than help it. What do I mean by that? If I subsidize your electric car, first of all, that doesn't make energy less expensive for the society as a whole. But second, all that does is free up some gas or oil for someone else to burn,
right?
Likely an Indian or Bangladeshi. Because what counts to the climate is how much oil is burned over 50 to 100 years. So if we just delay it for a year or two, it makes no difference. If I don't burn it, if I drive Palo Alto, you drive a Toyota Prius down to your private jet, that's called saving the climate. But that just frees up energy for someone else to burn. So, vast amounts of money. And in the U.S., so our climate policies were, we want solar panels, electric vehicles, but God forbid we import them from China where they can make them cheaply. No. They must be made at 5 times the cost by American ingredients with American union labor providing American childcare. So there again, you can see it is a giant crony capitalist subsidy system that is not helping the climate and has driven up energy costs so that industry has left Europe and largely left in the UK. Nuclear energy was regulated out of existence over fantastical safety. Right? Again, a classic of a regulatory agency that grows and grows and grows and grows and uses anything to, it is by far the safest way of making energy that we have now. So, we take a 0.00001 chance and add a couple more zeros at tremendous cost. Next thing you know, we're making energy from far more dangerous sources instead of nuclear. So that got killed. So, you just look at what does it cost per kilowatt hour, and then what does it cost society, including all the subsidies. And that's a large part of why Europe and the UK are deindustrializing. Average Joe is going to figure that out soon. It seems to be on their way to figuring that out. And I think that too will be another exposure of elites who, let themselves get whipped up into. There's nothing in the science that says crisis, emergency, or justice or whatever. And they really hurt their economies and the average people over what turns out to be nothing.
So you talked about institutions being incompetent and politicized. Now, it sounds like the Trump administration definitely thinks that applies to the Fed.
Yes.
But there are dangers maybe in the approach that the administration may take towards central bank reform. You've written a little bit about this recently. Fill us in.
And I'm writing more right now. So
okay.
It's lovely to talk about because it's on my mind. So one needs to take the minute you say the word Trump, everybody needs to take a deep breath. Calm down a little bit, because he is running roughshod through all sorts of American administrative agencies. But on the other hand, they had it coming.
Yeah.
And they proved incapable of internal reform. We might prefer different methods, but at least recognize that something needed to be done. So the Fed is similar. When we look, objectively, the Fed did what every other independent agency does. It's slow mission creep. The mission got bigger and bigger and bigger. The mission got more and more political. Bank of England and ECB, even worse. They're deep into climate change, and whoever gave you a mandate, I don't want to debate climate change or not. I want cost, benefit, effective policies, and I want environmental agencies to do climate change and central banks to stay out of things that don't concern them. That's The deal of independence is you get a lot of independence, but you stay in your wheelhouse. It's kind of funny. We give central banks, do you want them to control inflation? What's the most powerful thing you could do to create inflation? Give people money. They're not allowed to do it.
Right.
What's the most powerful way to stop inflation? Take people's money. They're not allowed to do that. Why not? Well, because that's, the Treasury and the government. Only accountable institutions can do the most powerful thing. So they're limited to working on the edges. So they've been granted this independence within a limited mandate. And then, like all institutions, they go busting around the limits of this mandate, buying all sorts of securities, propping up markets. And in this regulatory context, the financial regulation is more and more intrusive. And it includes not just writing rules, but supervision. The Fed has employees at all the big banks looking over every deal. Well, can you be independent when you're doing that? Plus, of course, steering money to communities. The Fed, it's kind of funny that the Trump and the right wing are mad about the Fed and want it to bend more politically. But the complaint is that the Fed bent too much politically. It gave money to who the Democrats wanted to give money to, and everybody went, they started getting involved in equity and place-based policies and so forth that were none of their business. And so personally, I think the answer is get the institution back to within its limits. Fortunately, the effort by Trump is make the institution, here's this big, powerful institution, make it do what we want it to do quickly.
Not thinking that the other guys will come in and then make it do exactly what they want to do, and you've expanded executive power, and now your enemies are using it against you.
So the Fed is a small part of this larger problem in American politics, which is the ever greater concentration of power in the president. And so we are not a democracy who elects a king every 4 years. We have a constitution. You guys should write yours downward these days. That would help you, especially on like free speech issues. And rule of law, and the executive implements the laws and so forth. Congress has gotten weaker and weaker. The agencies got more and more independently powerful, and the executive has gotten more and more powerful. Now there's this move to try to make the executive more powerful still in order to rein in the agencies. But that leads to, electing a king every 4 years. So the first thing he does is wipes out the last king's executive orders and then writes a whole bunch of his own. So yes, we were getting around towards the Fed. Trump wants to do this to the Fed as he has to so many other agencies. And that's the reason I'm emphasizing the other stuff is I think this is a large political question that we all need to think about. When do we put this sword back in the sheath? It's particularly acute with justice and our FBI and our Justice Department and so forth. I think Trump had a legitimate complaint that the intelligence agencies and the justice agencies were used politically to go after him to try to keep him out of office. I wish, they had said, good, we need to get back to norms and balances and checking rules and constraint. No, they're just, great.
Time
this
for
was handy.
revenge.
Time for revenge. We're going to do unto you like you've done unto us. Anyway, so let's get to the Fed.
Yeah,
I did want to put it into this context of the broader issue because the Fed is just one small problem of that. Right now, so the context is not about the expansion of powers into, quantitative easing and buying assets and financial regulation, which is where kind of the intellectual complaints about the Fed are. People writing books now about Fed independence are really worried about that. Trump wants lower interest rates. And he wants them now. And it's interesting that he wants them, given that, Biden's inflation probably cost him and then Harris the election. Why would Trump want to do that to himself is something I'm wondering about. I think it's coming down to something much more classic. When we think about Fed independence, we think about, creating inflation to boost the economy. He wants lower interest costs on the debt. He doesn't like the deficit is constraining him. He wants low deficits, lower interest costs on the debt, which is what central banks, this is a 200-year-old issue. When a government is in fiscal problems, central banks can hold down interest costs on the debt for a while, and then that causes inflation, and then you pass laws to force people to hold government debt, and then you pass price controls. That's what we all do in wars.
Right.
He kind of wants wartime finance out of the Fed. So that's a deep Fed independence question. And, when you're fighting a war, that's what you do. It's not clear that we're fighting a war right now. We're at the top of an economic cycle. There's no crisis whatsoever. So, but that's certainly the way to frame what he wants in terms of low interest rates.
And whereas your approach would be to narrow the remit of the central bank. And I think from what I've read, you favor basically zero inflation. That we try and just stabilize the price level and keep it there, make up for any shortfalls or overshoots in future years. But that's their job.
Period.
Price stability, forget the rest.
Yes. Though I have this book, Fiscal Theory at the Price Level, which acknowledges that central banks are not all powerful. So in fact, within the conventional way of thinking about monetary policy, price level target is where I think our government should go. We should stop having inflation every year. We don't shorten the meter 2% a year to make the tailors a little better off. Why should we, why should we shorten the pound to the dollar 2% every year? That makes no sense. So yes, I think monetary policy should aim for a stable price level over long periods of time.
And how do you respond?
Which will be joint central bank. Unfortunately, that needs fiscal policy and central bank together.
Okay. Well, let's come to the fiscal policy just in a second. But for our listeners, how do you respond to the standard economic arguments against price stability? Sort of the consensus is, well, you need 2 or 3% inflation a year in a modern economy. I guess because of zero lower bound problems in a crisis or downward stickiness of prices and wages. Do you think that's all just kind of silly?
No, I don't think it's silly. I think those are genuine arguments that I don't think are correct.
Right.
And if they were correct, would make more sense. Now, why, I don't think extra stimulus is that necessary. So like 2008 was a great example. There was a financial heart attack. The arteries got clogged and the economy fell. Once the arteries got unclogged, it's not clear to me that the short-term interest rate being 0 or -1 or -2% makes that much difference overall at all. And I love the stability of long price. And you also have, so why does 2% inflation 2 years ago make any difference to the economy now when we're in the crisis? It's zero. The interest rate's 0 now. Why does what the interest rate was 2 years ago matter? Well, it's sort of the theory that having shoes that are 2 sizes too small feels so good when you take them off at night. Now, more seriously, the idea behind it is if people expect 2% inflation in the future, that we will go back to 2% inflation, then the 0 interest rate is effectively a -2% interest rate. But now a price level target achieves much the same thing because the level of prices falls in a crisis. And if we know the level of prices is going to come back up again, you have the same thing as expected inflation. Just, it ends when the price level has recovered. So I don't see why we need expected inflation forever in order to have a little bit of expected reflation coming out of a crisis. And the Fed actually put that in, the flexible average inflation targeting, blah, 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 had some of that element. It wasn't symmetric. So I think that would also be useful symmetric. If you're in a boom and there's been some inflation, knowing that we're going to bring the price level back down would be very useful to containing the inflation of the boom, same ways as containing the deflation of the recession. So I think those arguments miss kind of that longer run, and they're kind of back of the envelope. Yeah. It fits a deeper problem, which we need to understand. When we talk about monetary policy, everyone thinks they know what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing. And I mean that in the most charitable sense. The doctrine of monetary policy, higher interest rates, lower demand, which then through a Phillips curve lowers inflation. It's a lovely story. It was encapsulated in about 1976 and has not changed since. The equations of every economic model don't work that way. So there's this massive disconnect between how any respectable economics works and what central bankers talk about. So just beware when you're talking about central banking. When they use big, high, fancy words, that doesn't really correspond to anything that anybody knows how it's working. So part of it is keep it simple.
It's like the Bernanke thing that it works in practice, but it doesn't work in theory.
Right.
That's kind of describes central banking in a larger sense. So let's come to
which raises the question: if you don't have any way of understanding how it works in theory, do you really know that it works in practice the way you think it works? Because practice is a collection of experience, but it doesn't tell you counterfactuals. You need theory to understand, well, if we had done something different, what would have happened? Practice never can teach you that.
So tell us about the fiscal theory of the price level. This grew out of the pandemic inflation or the post-pandemic inflation. Is that what kind of got you onto this new theory that you developed?
Actually, no. So I've been working on this for 30 years.
Okay.
And out of this frustration, reading all of the academic work on where does inflation coming from, and when you read the equations going, my God, this is crazy. We need a better theory. We need an actual theory that works, given that our central banks don't set money supply targets. So the money supply story, it's a lovely story, but they don't control the money supply, so it's done. We need something about interest rate targets. So I was working on this for 30 years, and kind of grew out of a project of theoretical purity. It's actually a more Milton Friedman and Hayek view of inflation than even they were able to come from. It's very simple supply and demand. And so I wrote it, and I sent in the manuscript in 2021. Before there was any inflation, the introduction said, we haven't seen any inflation since the Reagan era. No one's going to care about this. You'll sell 3 copies of this book, but put it on the shelf. Someday maybe they'll do something so dumb as to print up $5 trillion of money, hand it out, and we'll get an inflation, and you'll need to understand where it came from. And fortunately, I got to change that introduction because they did exactly that. So the timing is the opposite, and I just got extremely lucky that the most classic exercise in fiscal theory of the price level is exactly what they did in 2021. Now, why everybody else doesn't see that is beyond me. But the fiscal theory of the price level says inflation fundamentally comes from more money or government debt is issued. Deficits we have big deficits, and there is no credible plan to repay the debt. Government debt's a wonderful thing. Debt and deficits do not cause inflation necessarily. If the government borrows money to fight a war, and everybody understands after the war ends, you're going to raise taxes and pay back the money, then you can borrow an immense amount of money and there's no inflation because people are happy to hold that debt. So it's money and debt without a clear plan for repayment. And that's exactly what happened. U.S., U.K., Europe, around the world. They treated COVID like a war. They applied the standard methods of war finance, exactly what we did in World War I, World War II, Revolutionary War, Civil War. In each time there was an inflation. And that's exactly what they did. And it's exercise 1 of chapter 1 of Fiscal Theory of the Price Level.
So it's crucial that there are 2 sides to this. One is the kind of expansionary fiscal policy, the debt, the deficits. But then there's also the second part, which is about expectations, I suppose, that people lose faith that these debts will ever be repaid.
That's it.
I mean, in a sense, is the concern there, whether people would think of it this way or articulate it this way, this ultimately is the underlying issue, that if there's no credible plan to pay down the debt or eliminate the deficits, then it's going to be monetized.
Yes.
They're going to inflate away.
And
so do you sort of come back to a quasi-monetarism in the end there? Yeah.
Well, not quite. I'll distinguish the monetarism in a sense. But yes, if you know that they're either going to default on it or inflate it away in the future, you don't care which of those is because it means you lose your money, then you try to get rid of the government debt now.
Yeah.
And so the inflation happens now. So it works very much like stocks. If you know the stock will be worthless in the future, you try to sell it now, the price goes down now. So that that mechanism brings it forward. Now, it's not monetarism. Yes, it's too much money chasing too few goods, but how much money is too much? So the crucial difference, monetarism teaches too much money chasing too few goods causes inflation, but monetarism teaches that it's money versus bonds. So that if I give you $5 trillion, monetarists and I agree, there's going to be inflation. But if I give you $5 trillion and take back $5 trillion treasury bills, well, what about that? Now, monetarists say the money supply went up, so whether you took back treasury bills or it was just a gift doesn't matter whatsoever. All that matters is the money supply. Whereas from a fiscal point of view, giving you money and taking back treasury bills is like giving you, 2 5s and a 10 and taking back your 20s. Now, fortunately, we just had this experiment. The best experiment you could ask to distinguish monetarism from fiscal theory just happened. Because in the COVID era, $5 trillion, no plans to pay it back. It was money. The Fed printed up $3 trillion of that, handed it out as checks. Boom, inflation. QE, here's $5 trillion. We take back $5 trillion of treasury. What did that do to inflation? Nothing. Not a zip. It didn't budge. And it should have been an atom bomb. This was an immense amount of money. So, that just proves the difference between monetarism and fiscal. And to be fair, nobody had really seen that before. So most of the history that convinced monetarists was times of governments printing up money in order to finance deficits.
Right.
So this experiment, hand out an enormous amount of money and take back an enormous amount of treasuries, they never got to see that, so they didn't know it wouldn't work.
So in terms of making this a kind of operational theory, if you're the central bank and you have the mandate for price stability, how does it change the way you as a central bank operate?
Well, it does. It means finally the equations in your theory correspond to how they are coherent. Central banks remain very important in fiscal theory because central banks set interest rates, and interest rates are very powerful for setting the path of inflation. They are just not all powerful as they are in standard view. So these are kind of classic issues. There's a tension between monetary policy and fiscal policy. Fiscal policy wants to run big unfunded deficits. Central banks can fight them if they want to. A sufficiently powerful central bank could say, we're going to force you to default. We're not going to give you the money to pay back your debts and force you to reform or default. Central banks typically don't. But so that tension, every well-written theory of monetary economics, monetarism, Keynesianism, new Keynesianism, has footnotes about, oh, by the way, fiscal policy needs to help. And I think really what fiscal theory of the price level does is it makes it, and current events, is those footnotes need to come out of the footnotes and be part of how we think about things. And I'll just try to make this concrete. Suppose our Fed, as it probably will soon, has to react to a resurgence of inflation by raising interest rates. When you raise interest rates, that raises interest costs on the debt. That's big now. We have 100% debt to GDP, so a 1% interest rate is 1% of GDP extra deficit. In every theory of inflation there is, fiscal policy comes along and raises taxes or cuts spending to pay that. It's a joint monetary fiscal policy. And the reality, as well as fiscal theory, says, hey, bring that footnote up and pay attention to it. Because if Powell goes down to Congress and says, I'm raising interest rates 2%, I need you to raise taxes 2% of GDP to pay the interest costs on the debt. Otherwise, every theory we have says this won't control inflation. Congress is going to laugh its head off. And the administration is going to go ballistic because that's what so that monetary fiscal coordination, which is centerpiece of fiscal theory, but it exists in every other theory. This is the real present question. Can we raise rates to contain inflation and have the fiscal underpinnings that are needed? Latin American countries have often had fiscal problems, printing money, inflation. Central banks raise interest rates. That lowers inflation for a little while, but then they haven't solved the fiscal problem. Boom, inflation comes right back again. So that's
because the central bank eventually kind of acquiesces to the government's desire to inflate the debt away?
Yes.
Make their life easier? Yeah.
Will our central banks really cross their arms and say, we are going to have a debt crisis. You are going to default or restructure rather than me print money to get you out of this trouble?
I mean, like you said, we've seen it with COVID.
Well, yes, they bailed in COVID. They saw tiny little increases in treasury spreads, proclaimed markets dysfunctional and fragmented, and bought nearly the entire new issue of treasury. So we monetized that bingo in COVID exactly as predicted.
Yeah. So I guess critics will say you're a free market economist, you're a fiscal conservative, you just want governments not to run deficits, not to build up large debts. I mean, is that a fair criticism? I'm not saying that the theory doesn't hold, but that ultimately the implication of your theory is we just have to run balanced budgets.
No. Thank you. We need to run balanced budgets over long periods of time.
Okay.
We need to spend responsibly as if taxpayers have to pay for it, because either current or future taxpayers will have to pay for it. I think government debt is a wonderful institution. It's how the UK won the Napoleonic Wars. So classically, the UK was smaller than France.
Yeah.
How did you win? Well, the French king could not promise to repay debts, kept defaulting on them, so he couldn't borrow. The UK, by inventing the Bank of England and by having Parliament need to approve all tax increases, meant the king couldn't go, and expending, the king couldn't go do what he wanted. And the king was forced to repay debts. But being forced to repay debts, the limitation on your absolute power, meant that you could commit to repay them and you could borrow. So borrowing to finance a crisis, spreading the pain over a generation of higher taxes, and then paying off slowly over time is wonderful. But that's the paying back part is where all of our societies are a little weak right now. Historically, Alexander Hamilton was really, we're going to pay back the Revolutionary War debt in order to why? I mean, why should we pay all this back? In order to establish our creditworthiness so we can borrow in the future. That sort of sanctity of pay it back is what's going on. So I love well-run, well-managed government debt. The problem now, of course, is not the debt. The problem is that we are on an ongoing basis spending way more than we take in. Now, really, the answer to that is economic growth.
Right.
Let's just, to bring it back, how do you solve the debt problem? How do you solve? Well, one, we spend like only slightly drunken sailors. We reform our social programs so they're actually helping people who need it and not giving free Mercedes to everybody who says they're disabled or whatever's. This is the latest story I heard from the UK. I can't believe it's true. So reform the spending, but then you reform the taxes, as we said, or we've already figured out how that one to do, and then get out of the way so that, tax revenue is tax rate times GDP. So lots more GDP is the best way to actually pay off our debts.
All right. So let's move on to your latest book, which is about the euro crisis cycle. I mean, it's a great title. I guess it encapsulates the theme of the book, that the euro is stuck in a cycle of crisis after crisis, because I think of flaws in its institutional design. Tell us what's the point of view you're putting forward in this book?
Yes, it's so the euro was actually quite well set up. The crises happened that no one imagined. Expedients were tried in the crisis. But what the failure was not to reform after each of the crises, not particularly in the setup. So let me try and now bracket it. Contrary to the usual shibboleth, it is perfectly possible to have a monetary union without fiscal union and without political union. Europe had that for 1,000 years. Everyone used gold coins. There wasn't a fiscal union, and God knows there wasn't a political union. It was at each other's throats for 1,000 years. So if you're going to have a monetary union without the other unions, there's a problem, which is somebody might run up a bunch of debt and then say, oh, heavens, crisis, ECB print money to bail me out. There's already that problem with, a single government. The Treasury says, oh, crisis, markets are fragmented. Please, central bank, print money to bail me out. It's worse when there's, 20 different fiscal policies in one printing press. Now, the architects of the euro understood this problem very well, and they set up a lot of constraints against it. The ECB had only a price level mandate, no other mandates, just almost the ideal thing we talked about. Now, they interpreted price level to mean 2% inflation, but what the heck, that's minor. They weren't supposed to do anything else. They were not supposed to buy government debt at all, which is, the U.S. is kind of restricted to buying government debt except in emergencies. But if you want to avoid fiscal monetization, you don't buy government debt. Countries were supposed to have debt and deficit limits, but we never got around to the central part. If you have a currency union without fiscal union, countries have to default just like companies.
Right.
Default doesn't mean leave the euro. If a big company defaults, they don't leave the euro. But a country has to, we always have to have that option in the end. They default, the creditors don't get their money. And nobody could quite say that out loud. In particular, banking regulation still treats all sovereign debts as risk-free. So banks don't have to issue capital to hold sovereign debt the same way that they do to hold corporate debt. It's just a risk-free asset. So now, if the country goes under, the banks all go under.
Right.
And so you scream, crisis, come bail me out. And there's no bankruptcy resolution mechanism. A company, there's bankruptcy court, there's debtor in possession financing, there's a way to work it out, to restructure. Bankruptcy is not about a big hole in the ground, it's about restructuring. Well, there isn't a restructuring mechanism. But of course, that was perfectly natural. It's 1999, and we're all trying to get together. And, on your wedding night, you don't negotiate the prenup really hard. So if you go to Gucci, honey, and spend too much on a handbag, how are we going to resolve it? You don't want to get involved with that, right? It's not going to be a pleasant wedding night about that. And so, of course, we're going to behave. And if anything goes wrong, we'll figure it out. Well, then, of course, the financial crisis came, the sovereign debt crisis came, the low growth era came, the inflation, the COVID came, the war came. In each one, there was a crisis. The ECB felt it's the only game in town. And so they bought lots of sovereign debts. They prop up markets. Every time Italian bond yields sneezed, the ECB said, oh, fragmentation, dysfunction. They bought Italian bonds. So now where are we? The ECB has these enormous portfolio of sovereign debts. No matter what the ECB says in its language about fragmentation, dysfunction, everybody understands they're not going to let sovereign spreads rise. And the countries don't feel any incentive to run the kind of responsible fiscal policy that we talked about, because they know in the end the ECB will. They're not feeling the market message. Normally, if countries start, interest rates start going up, people say, well, I don't know about that. And countries say, oh, boy, we better really. But if the ECB is tamping down those interest rates, then they don't get the message. So time to clean that up, guys. Finally, let's reform the system, which mostly means sovereign debt is risky. Shouldn't be in banks, especially banks in that country that will go under. We need a crisis resolution mechanism, a sort of an IMF for Europe. And we need the ECB to say, we are not buying sovereign debts. We're going to let you go down. This is risky stuff. Sovereign debts are risky stuff. Risky assets are fine. We hold stocks. We hold corporate bonds. Yeah. Those are in the hands of people who can take the risks and who bear the rewards. Sovereign debt has to be the same way. Before France goes under, which it's not Italy anymore, it's not Greece. Now it's France. The window for reform is getting smaller and smaller.
So you need a way for the countries to go bust, effectively, if they've overborrowed.
Yes.
How do you stop that from collapsing the financial sectors and then plunging into a sort of Great Depression style scenario?
Well, those sovereign debts. So we don't bail out countries. We bail out the creditors. Remember that. We say bail out Greece. It's not bailing out. It's bailing out Greece's creditors that counts. Sovereign debts need to be in hands that can bear risk, the same way equity is in hands that can bear risk. Not in banks that are stuffed banks. Greek debt shouldn't be in the hands of Greek banks that will all go under, because the Greek government also provides the deposit insurance.
Right.
So national banks with national deposit insurance stuffed with national bonds is a terrible structure. That's what caused the financial crisis. But suppose that sovereign debts were held in mutual funds, so that European pension funds and investors held a diversified portfolio of sovereign debts. They are able to bear risk. They are able to enjoy higher returns of they have equities. Goodness gracious, equities are far more risky than anybody's sovereign debts, right? So they can, okay, you're only getting 80 cents on the dollar. Not great. You go home, you kick this dog, you have a whiskey. It's not, but you don't have a bankruptcy. You don't have a run. So crisis is always a run, and a run is always short-term debt. A run is that a risky asset was financed by short-term debt that gets to come and say, no, I want my money back or you're bankrupt. Well, sovereign debt has to be like equity. It has to be long-term debt, diversified portfolios, and people who can't run to get their money back, and then it's not a crisis.
So within this framework, tell me about your approach to regulating banks. I think you have kind of fairly radical proposals here, big departure from the status quo, or indeed the sort of the typical history of banking and the way it's evolved over time. Is it fair to say that you're a narrow banker? Would that be the way to put it?
Well, let's take so one always the minimum necessary. So to cure Europe, it would be enough that if banks held diversified portfolios of sovereign debt within Europe, that would be enough. And if there were open international banking, so that if a Greek bank had German assets, that would be enough. We don't have to cure that whole financial crisis problem. Though we are, I do worry now what when France and Germany goes under and the U.S. So we are exposed to this grand sovereign debt crisis that nobody sees coming. But the larger question is, how do we replace the mess of financial regulation? Yes, and there I am, a narrow deposit taker and an equity financed banker. I don't like to call it narrow banking because it sounds like we're going to get rid of banks. No, banks are going to be great. They're going to make all sorts of risky loans. They're just going to get the money to make risky loans by issuing equity or long-term debt, not by issuing something that can run. And then deposits will go into, will be backed by interest-paying reserves or short-term treasury debts, and then you never have a run again. No private sector financial crisis. It is within our grasp to never again have a private sector financial crisis. Never again have to bail out financial institutions because crisis. Who doesn't like this? The banks that now get access to really cheap deposits and free government insurance on the deposits and can negotiate the way around any of the risk limits and then get bailed out once every 20 years. So the politics is against it, but the economics is pretty clear.
Yeah. Now, is there a danger there as well that you would maybe starve businesses of capital, of financing? I mean, maybe less of a problem in the US where there's a big VC scene and everything. But in Britain and Europe particularly, business is very heavily bank financed. If you're effectively getting rid of maturity transformation, which I think is the implication of what you're saying, is there a danger there that we kind of cause a credit crunch?
There is no such thing as transformation.
Yeah.
The pizza is the pizza. We can slice it differently. And, equity can get a bigger slice and debt get a smaller slice. But the pizza is the pizza. When you transform maturity, somebody is bearing the duration risk. And it's just a question of who bears that duration risk. So equity can bear a larger slice of a much smaller duration risk, and short-term debt is just a much lesser slice of the pie. So there's no less capital. In fact, it's maybe more capital, if anything, available to make risky loans. And that goes in Europe as well as the US. In fact, right now, we almost have narrow banking. Because I know the numbers for the U.S. I think Europe is similar. We have these enormous amounts of interest-paying reserves. So the interest-paying reserves pretty much back the checking deposits. Unfortunately, it's within the bank that if the other side fails, that also fails. But if you just carve them out, we pretty much have that system already. And we're going there fast just by other means. So stablecoins are going to make an end run around our central bank's refusal to allow narrow banks to emerge and create narrow banks. So it may happen. But just the most common fallacy is that this reduces the supply of capital.
Yeah.
Or that they'll have to charge, the cost of capital will be higher and they'll have to charge higher rates. Now wait. The theory is you take an oligopolistic industry, you subsidize. They can have deposits cheap. And out of the goodness of their heart, they're going to turn around and lend it at a lower rate, not just absorb that as profit. That's not the way oligopolies work to start with. And if we want to subsidize lending, if we want taxpayer money to go into lower rates for borrowers, let's just do it. Let's have a subsidy for borrowing, not we will insure your deposits, pretend that our risk managers can stop you from taking too much risk and bail you out once a generation and thereby fund taxpayer money into loans. Why don't you just do it directly and it'll be much clearer what we're doing?
Well, I always like to try and end on an optimistic note.
Oh, yes.
But actually, you've given me an opportunity to end on a really pessimistic note instead, so I'm going to take that opportunity. There was an implication in what you said. You were talking about France, Italy, the US potentially defaulting on its debts. Do you see the fiscal problem in the US as being so big and so difficult to solve, at least within the bounds of political reality, that effectively a sovereign default in the US is a realistic possibility? And what would be the implications of that? They'd be pretty massive.
A sovereign restructuring is a much greater possibility than anyone thinks. Certainly a technical default. We get to a debt ceiling and the Treasury Secretary says, no, I'm not paying off principal and interest first. I'm paying checks to Social Security recipients first. That could happen and would be a financial, let's talk about the financial calamity there when this supposedly defaults. For one, it would not be, you couldn't use it as collateral against loans. So right now we have a big major hiccup in the financial system. A larger restructuring is not out of the question either. I hope it doesn't happen. A financial repression, inflation, if we don't cure the debt problem, the debt and deficit problem, that's where countries go that are financing themselves by printing money. Watch out for your wallets. One-time capital taxes is how we get rid of debts, or taxing. They already talked about, let's tax the foreigners' holdings of U.S. treasuries. So those kinds of messy solutions. Now, you said this is not hard at all. We are an economy at peace by historical standards. Russia, Ukraine, it's a terrible war, but it's not World War II. And as military expenditures, 3% of GDP. No one's ever spent as little as 3% of GDP on military stuff. When you're spending 50% of GDP on welfare programs, so there's no external threat. It's simply an internal unwillingness to reform. I don't like it's not cut. It's reform spending to help people who need it efficiently, paying attention to the incentives. Reform taxes to raise revenue efficiently and not try to do 120 different things under the roof. So from an economic point of view, any number of your institute scholars here could put together a plan in about 10 minutes that would solve this. There's no plague. There's no armies at the gates. It's entirely internal. Now, what's politically possible? Well, that changes quickly. Would Trump have been politically possible? Would you have said 2015? And to an optimistic note, suppose we had taken bets in 2016 that the next president of Argentina would have been a libertarian whose dogs were named von Mises and Hayek. Nobody would have taken that bet. So what's America will reliably do the right thing after we've tried everything else, the saying goes.
There you go.
I hope the UK and European Union are the same, because nothing I would like more than to see both shake off these economic, political, and institutional doldrums and get back to where we belong as the center of innovation and progress.
All right. Well, John, I've hugely enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us at the IEA today.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure.
Cheers.